second largest republic in the Soviet Union after Russia. It was Russia's main trade partner. Ukraine was in many ways the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. After the counter-revolution overthrew the governments in the Soviet Union, in Russia, in Ukraine, Ukraine became independent. And for the last, all the time since 1991, all the time, almost 30 years, the U.S. has been pumping in billions of dollars through the so-called National Endowment for Democracy, other non-governmental organizations. And then in 2013, in the fall of 2013, when the Russian government, I think, was preoccupied with the Sochi Olympics, the Winter Olympics, and there was lots of, international protests coming, and they were worried that the Olympics would be disrupted. These protests began in the middle of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. It was called Maidan, meaning the Maidan Square protests. And they went on for November and December and January. And then in early February, mid-February, really, a deal was struck between the opposition forces to the Yanukovych government, who were pro-European, pro-EU, pro-NATO, and the Yanukovych government, which was a government that wasn't pro-Russian, but sought neutrality between East and West and vowed that Ukraine would never become a part of NATO. They came to a deal with Yanukovych, and the Russians were at the table, and the Germans were at the table, and the French were at the table, and the U.S. was at the table, but as an observer. And there was an agreement that Yanukovych would pull the police out of the center of Kiev, that he would call early elections in Ukraine, meaning allowing the opposition to replace him as the president. He would devolve authority from the center of Ukraine to the regions, which was another demand of the opposition. And he signed that agreement with international observers watching on February 21st, 2014. On February 22nd, 2014, fascist-led militias stormed the parliament, dispersed the parliament, tried to kill the president. He fled for his life, and they created a neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine at that time. The whole eastern part of the country speaks Russian, was historically part of Russia. I mean, in 1625, Kiev was a capital of Russia. I mean, it's always been historically part of Russia, at least the eastern part of Ukraine. They banned the Russian language, and they made it clear that they were going to join NATO. Now, at that moment, the U.S. thought, and by the way, John McCain, Hillary Clinton spokespersons, they were all in Maidan. They were handing out cookies to the protesters. The U.S. government, both parties, joint operation, all the U.S. media cheering them on, saying this was the greatest day for Ukrainian democracy when the fascists stormed the parliament and dispersed the government. And they thought, okay, we have Russia by the throat. And it was then that Putin said, look, we're going to let the people in Crimea, who are almost all Russian speakers and ethnically Russian, we're going to let them have a referendum about whether under these circumstances they want to reaffix Crimea to Russia. And they had a referendum in June 2014, and 95% of the people voted yes, we prefer to be with Russia. Crimea had always been part of Russia. It was only given to Ukraine in 1954 by Nikita Khrushchev when Ukraine and Russia were part of the same country, the Soviet Union. And so when Putin did that, the United States accused Russia of seizing Ukraine because that referendum took place in Crimea where the people voted to associate with Russia rather than Ukraine. The other part of that equation that's very important for people who don't know enough about this situation to understand is Crimea was the most important naval base for the Soviet Union. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, after the Soviet Federation or Union broke up, there was an agreement between the Ukrainian, now independent Ukrainian government and the Russian government that the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Naval Base, the largest military installation that Russia has, would remain part of Russia, even though Crimea was technically a part of Ukraine. So when the U.S.-led fascist coup d'etat took place, Vladimir Putin realized that the Russian primary biggest military base, the largest naval base, would now become a NATO base with nuclear missiles pointed at Russia. That was too much. And so then, and only then, did Russia go forward and allow this referendum to take place. And since then, the United States and all of the politicians and the media have labeled Putin to be and Russia to be the aggressor. But that's the actual context. And so Russia now feels that Ukraine, which was the exact, planes through which Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, what Putin is saying is, this is a red line for us. We are not going to allow Ukraine, formerly our biggest ally, the second biggest republic in the Soviet Union, to be used by NATO to prepare for an invasion of Russia. That's not going to happen. That's why we are now at the verge of a major power conflict between the US and Russia. And the reason I wanted to give a little bit of this history is that the American people don't know about it. And they just think, because they're told every day, that Putin is bad, he's an autocrat, and Russia is an aggressor, when in fact, Putin, and in this case, Russia, are the victim of Western aggression.
Good evening, patriots, freedom fighters throughout Saskatchewan, across the country, and around the world. Shit's hitting the fan a little bit, and we have to talk about it. We have to actually offer some different perspective, contrary to what the media is putting out there. The media wants you stupid, right? They want you to just nod your head, let them develop the narrative, let them develop the situation, and then you can just walk around like a seal, regurgitating what they say. That's the media's job. That's what they do. But it's important that we actually have a discussion about what's really happening. And I thought that video was very good. I wanted to start the show off with that video because I think they did a pretty good job in a short amount of time explaining, some of what's happening. I've had a couple of discussions with Salim in this regard. And again, it's just such a pleasure to have Salim Mansur join us, a man that's, history professor. He knows his stuff. He knows a lot of the historical context to what's happening right now in the Ukraine and why it's happening. So without further ado, let's have Salim join us. Hello, my friend. How are you?
Good evening, Mark. I'm good. I'm good. I hope you're good too.
Yeah, I am. I'm, of course, like everybody else, a little hyper focused on what's happening in the Ukraine, and so I thought, of course, obviously very important for us to offer a different perspective than what the media is putting and portraying. We can see our politicians like Pierre Poilievre joining, the Ukrainians in Ottawa last night in support of their freedom, which is interesting. He never showed up to any rally in 2 years for Canadians' freedoms, but but it's funny how they virtue signal and they'll jump on this because they believe that the media will indoctrinate the narrative and place the narrative where most of the population is going to go with that narrative. So that's exactly how they choose to do business. Whereas we do business a little differently. We try to look at what's really happening. And I think it's important that we do that and we offer a contrarian perspective to what's going on. And for the record, my disclaimer is I'm not a Putin fanboy. I'm not promoting Putin as the next coming. He's obviously up for some criticism as well in all of this, but there needs to be perspective. So hopefully, Salim, after we're done the show, we'll add a little bit more perspective to things.
I hope so. The video that you showed just coming ahead of bringing me in was a very useful video. It puts things in some context within the scope of the video, the time frame of the videos, 5-6 minutes. a very important context. And as I always say, and I keep repeating myself, that we have to put things into context, because without a context, without a contextual understanding of any issue, of any subject, a man accused of murder and brought to court, facing capital punishment, his lawyers will have to put that man into context of the describing the events that happen, and it will be
Mm.
left to the jury to make the judgment, which is not that the
Right.
lawyer for the man, that is the defense lawyer, is making the argument because he is a fanboy of the man who has been accused of a capital crime. So no, it is putting things in context, and only with that there can be a clarity. And who provides the context? It should be, must be, would have been, if we were a free society, that the media would be a free media in which
Right.
different perspectives would be presented, and then the people would have the context and reach the conclusion. And in the absence of that, what we have is a media that is always, all the time, engaged in narrative fabrication, narrative engineering to push an agenda.
Absolutely.
And so that's what any person, any individual, any society that is engaged in trying to understand difficult issues or simple issues, but especially difficult and complicated issues that we are confronting, not only in Ukraine at this moment, but it is a global issue that we are confronting. Ukraine is now the hotspot in this global confrontation that is taking place. We have gone through 2 years of confrontation in this country that ended up with the Emergency Act, and people are left puzzled what happened. So again, we have to go back to it. And so that's my opening remarks. And I hope I can provide that context in a comparative sense, not only putting Ukraine and Russia in this global framework of the last 30 years of globalization, of the Great Reset, of the World Economic Forum and the UN agenda, in that context, and that in the larger sense of history that is absolutely necessary in the particular situation of Ukraine and what is happening to understand. So given that, where do I begin? I mean, let me pull myself completely, pull this conversation for a moment completely out of Ukraine to put the largest framework. As you and I are speaking, February 2022, this week going by, was the 50th anniversary of the opening of US-China relationship, when President Nixon traveled to Beijing in 1972. Very important context. Very important context. Well, why? Because with that opening that President Nixon brought about, and ending the hostility between China and United States in terms of global affair, communism, Cold War, East-West competition and rivalry that had put America into war, or the West, including Canada, into war in Korea, and China was on the other side, and Soviet Union was on the other side, and massive casualties. And then the Vietnam War, when America engaged in Vietnam on the basis of stopping China and world communism, 50,000 Americans died, and it was a global affair. And people were affected everywhere, particularly in Asia. And so with that move, President Nixon and the United States triangulated Soviet Union, the great superpower, on the
Right.
other side, triangulated, and that began the, three power movement in which Soviet Union was no longer itself, open and one. It had to deal with China as a rival and as an enemy. They had a border conflict. They had a shootout in 1969 and so on. And the China-Soviet rivalry, though both are communist countries, if they were joined together, it would be a massive military power. And so that was so important in terms of global politics, geostrategy, the move that Nixon made. And right now, 50 years later, what is the situation? Biden administration's play over Ukraine and with Ukraine. And Biden administration is the third term of the Obama administration. So we actually are going back to 2009 when Obama administration was inaugurated. And we must keep in mind, the people must keep in mind that the break was the Trump administration. So that was an interruption. And we are back again to the Obama administration, climate change, World Economic Forum, UN agenda, and all of that, which we can talk about. What has happened now in this past 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks, Russia and China has come together in an alliance. President Putin was in Beijing for the Olympics in 2022 that just concluded, and you can bet that the number one conversation that President Putin and President Xi Jinping were happening was about Ukraine, and the two things coming together. And today, China is the biggest importer of oil and natural resources, timber, coal, platinum, steel, or iron ore from Russia. It is the biggest importer now, and that relationship has been forged because of what is happening on this side. And so the big question hanging is, what were these guys doing in bringing about the alliance between Beijing and Moscow? And that alliance is now clearly visible in the vote that has taken place in the Security Council, the vote that was moved by the Western powers to condemn condemn Russian Federation as the aggressor in this situation in Ukraine. And what happened to the UN Security Council resolution? Well, we know that Russia would have vetoed it because Russia is a veto power. Right. But China abstained on that vote because China is the other veto power. China abstained, and India abstained. And so what do you have? Right. The two largest rising powers in the Asian age, China and India, abstaining on a vote moved by America on Russian aggression in Ukraine, and it went nowhere, Right. And they have come together. So that's another backstory that is very important to keep in mind.
But it's very important, exactly. Yep.
Exactly. It is an absolutely important story. And nothing else in this dynamics that is going on is as important as Russia and China now allied together against the Western powers, or particularly the United States. And in that sense, Canada, because Canada is jumping up and down, as you just pointed out, with Pierre Poilievre, and there's nobody in Ottawa ready to put these things in context and ask the fundamental question, what is the national interest of Canada? Because we don't have national interest, we have a global interest. The World Economic Forum, Davos crowd interest, and Pierre Poilievre is jumping up and down because he's a Davos man, Right. As is Justin Trudeau, as is Chrystia Freeland. So what is Canada's national?
And I just on that note, in and of itself, I just noticed that Poilievre's campaign team includes John Baird, who's Mr. World Economic Forum and globalist, in his own right. So
and so is Jason Kenney on the other side, the premier. You mentioned Canadian Ukrainians. Our heart goes out to Canadian Ukrainian. That is the common people, just as the common people in Canada was stomped upon with the jackboots of the Liberal Party and the World Economic Forum, represented by the Prime Minister,
Right.
The jackboots are stomping upon the face of the Ukrainian people right now. The question is, whose jackboot it is? Who drove this matter into this situation?
That's right.
It was the 2 years of vaccine mandate and absolute, destruction of our fundamental rights and freedom that led to the protest movement in January. It did not happen from the blue. So what is it? Nothing happens from the blue. No, there is, again, back to the context. So our heart goes on to Ukrainian people, because the Ukrainian people are suffering the abuse brought upon them by the Western power, but the Ukrainian people will not be able to understand that because their emotions are completely tied up in it.
And they're being completely used and abused like pawns, as they have historically. I mean, this is nothing new for that poor country, Ukraine, and the folks that live there. And so I think it's important that we recognize that, and I'm glad that you did.
That's right. But again, the other side to recognize is, the flip side, there's always more than one side. There's two sides and multiple sides. It's like a Rubik's square. There are many sides in that Rubik's square cube. The other side is that the large portion, significant portion of the population in Ukraine, particularly the population on western part of Ukraine, participated, supported, and engaged with the Nazis during that horrible war in which Russian people, including Ukrainian, died in massive number as Germany, as Hitler's army, invaded Russia in 1941, and Ukrainian people were divided because they were Ukrainians.
Right.
Massive amount of Ukrainians who joined up with the Nazi. And we all know the background of our own Canadian Deputy Prime Minister, which side of the family, which side of her family was in that division. Her grandfather was working for Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis in Ukraine and then in Poland. So that's also the history that we need to put it into context, So, so this is difficult. But the other context, I said, this is the 50th anniversary of the China-US opening. There's another very important anniversary that is coming up, which again puts the whole matter of Ukraine in context. And that is the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
And just to remind the people, what was the Cuban Missile Crisis? Cuban Missile Crisis emerged as a result of Khrushchev, who was, by the way, a Ukrainian, General Secretary of the Communist Party of Soviet Union, and therefore the leader of Soviet Union after Stalin, was a Ukrainian. And it was Khrushchev's regime that put nuclear missiles, ballistic missiles, in Cuba. That when it was discovered by the Americans became a huge crisis. But why did Khrushchev put the missiles in Cuba? 90 miles south of Florida, that is in the backyard of the America, the superpower, the leader of the Western Bloc countries, capitalist, freedom, democracy, and Khrushchev puts the missile there. Why? Because Khrushchev was responding to the American missiles that had been placed in Turkey. Okay, so on the chessboard of this global conflict, the Cold War, and the deployment of strategic equipment, in this case, nuclear missiles, it was tit for tat. And in that tit for tat, eventually, diplomatically, without an outbreak of the war, because if there had been an outbreak of the war, it could have escalated to the nuclear level, both the superpowers.
Right.
And Europe was a divided continent between Warsaw Pact countries and NATO. um, President Kennedy very skillfully, and similarly on the Soviet side, Khrushchev, who was a man who would go hot and cold in public, but behind the scene, they negotiated. The Soviet vessels turned around from the quarantine that President Kennedy placed around Cuba. They turned around. They did not challenge the American Navy. They turned and went back. There was no conflict, and the missiles were removed from Cuba. So now the question is, what is that example 60 years ago this year has a relevance to Ukraine? And the quick short answer is everything.
Everything.
Because we are dealing here with geopolitics, geostrategy, you know, and just as Cuba was deep inside the American sphere of influence, 90 miles from Florida, Ukraine is deep inside the Russian sphere of influence. If you're going to go, poking into the eyes of the bear in his area,
Right.
then don't get surprised that eventually the bear jumps at you.
Right.
So there it is. This is an absolute, relevance in this discussion. So to put the American side into context, the American goes all the way back to President Monroe, the 5th president of the United States, one of the founding fathers of America. President Monroe in 1823 pronounced or proclaimed what has ever since been known as the Monroe Doctrine. And what the Monroe Doctrine says is it was directed at the European powers at that time, 19th century, before the American Civil War, 1823. But it made it very clear to the European powers, Britain, Spain, France, these were the big powers at that time. Germany was not at that time a big power, but Britain, France, and Spain were. And Spain was the biggest power in the Southern Hemisphere, Latin America, the Spanish Empire, all the way up to the American border through Mexico. And Florida was also part of the Spanish Empire. President Monroe's message was that America will not tolerate any further advancement or interest or positioning of the European powers in the Western Hemisphere. See, in the case of Russia, the great power that emerged after the Second World War, that was the Warsaw Pact country. Russia had gone all the way into Berlin as a result of the war. But that was an agreement that was made by the United States and Great Britain during the war, and the division of Europe that took place, in the famous language of Winston Churchill, the Iron Curtain, has descended from the Baltics to the Adriatics. That Iron Curtain dividing Europe was the sphere of influence between Moscow and the Western powers, divided Germany, which was neutralized, but France, Britain, and the United States. Okay. So we are dealing with geostrategic interests of great powers. Now, in 1990, with the bringing down of the Berlin Wall came down in 1989 November, and by 1990, there was the beginning of the unraveling of the Soviet Union. There were massive, movements taking place, and all of the Soviet Republic. In Poland, of course, Solidarity movement was coming to power, and so on. And there was the beginning of what we now know, we now understand, the collapse of the former Soviet Union. But
and I just wanted to, that's why I brought this map up, because I wanted to show this contrast from 1990, when at that time was when the Soviet Union collapsed, where
Exactly.
NATO was positioned at that time and where NATO is positioned in 2009 and now
Exactly.
in present day.
The advancement of NATO is advancement of bringing in 14 former Soviet republic from the Baltics, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, through Poland, Hungary,
Right.
Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, Romania, Bulgaria. There are 14 countries. I might have missed out some in remembering it, but 14 countries of the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet bloc alliance, were brought into the NATO by the Americans. But
Right.
we have to go back to 1990 when it all began and the discussion was taking place. And those documents have now been revealed, has been put out by the German government, which is a NATO country, which is Europe's main power, and those documents clearly shows that in 1990, when Gorbachev was still the leader of what was still the Soviet Union,
Right.
Union officially ended in 1991 December at Christmas. So from 1992, there is no Soviet Union. But in this period, between the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989 to the collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991, this 2-year period, there was a Soviet Union. And it was not only a Soviet Union is a military power. It's a nuclear
Right.
power. It is a veto country in the United Nations, And I say all these things as facts, not as a defense of anything. These are
Right.
the facts on the ground. And you've got to take the facts into account. And the leaders of the Western powers at that time, in Britain, Maggie Thatcher had been ousted. And so the leader Maggie Thatcher was replaced in 1991 by John Major, conservative prime minister, John Major. He was the prime minister. In France, it was President Francois Mitterrand was the president of France. In Germany, divided Germany that was going through the process of unification, the chancellor was Helmut Kohl, and the president in Washington was George Bush the senior. But it was, because it is Europe, it is European states that are negotiating it. And America, of course, is the leader of NATO, but the immediate ball is in the court of the European leaders. All the European leaders, John Major, Francois Mitterrand and his foreign minister, Roland Dumas, the Chancellor of Germany, Helmut Kohl, and his foreign minister, Genscher, they all, without any ambiguity and disagreement among them, they all said to Gorbachev that NATO will not advance 1 centimeter east of Germany.
Right.
In fact, they also said to Gorbachev, and there was an agreement, verbal.
Is that the Minsk agreement?
No, I'm talking about the unification of Germany. The unification of Germany in 1990, there was a understanding that as East Germany and West Germany came together and became one Germany, the NATO armies and NATO equipments would not be deployed in East Germany, because that's what we pushed them close to Poland and the Warsaw Pact countries, So everybody that is the leaders at that time were sensitive to the security concerns of Moscow, even as Moscow was weakening in terms of politics. If we pause and think about this, and the security arrangement that was at that time on the table, which led to later on in 1992, 1993, the making of what has become the Organization for the Security of Europe. It is called Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. So this is European country. It is not America. And Soviet, former Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, is a European country. Okay, so in the discussions that eventually came to shape the Security and Cooperation Conference, the Russian leaders at that time, Gorbachev, and then when Soviet Union collapsed, Boris Yeltsin, who became the president of Russian Federation, both of them talked with the European leaders that security is an indivisible concept. You cannot have a divided security. Security for European states and no security for the other states, you know. Security has to be indivisible, you know. It is clearly understood that. And so even as Soviet Union collapsed and disintegrated and was replaced by Russian Federation is a nuclear power country, apart from being a permanent member of the Security Council. So both sides were very concerned in the sense, sensitive in the sense that they have both to work together. And the issue that the Russians were concerned about was precisely what will be the NATO role. Will the NATO maintain its line as it is, or is it going to advance, expand to the east?
Right.
And all the leaders in the West gave the assurance. Then what happened? What changed it? Well, what changed it were the people in America led by the neoconservative war hawks like Dick Cheney and his buddy Paul Wolfowitz, who would become the Deputy Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush. But Dick Cheney was the biggest war hawk in President George Bush Sr.'s cabinet. And then later on, he would surface in as vice president for George W. Bush. But the whole lot of war hawks, neoconservative, and then on the other side, on the Democratic side, by the way, the biggest war hawk among the Republicans and neoconservatives was John McCain, Senator John McCain. And he will surface over and over again in the Ukrainian issue. And of course, the bureaucrats deeply embedded in the Department of Defense and in the Department of State, you know. And the name of people like Victoria Nuland, who becomes the Assistant Secretary of State in that administration of Obama and Hillary Clinton, will surface time and time again with their agenda. So on the Democratic side were the people who were one world order people. Liberal international order was the code word. They were the globalists. And they were now so arrogant in terms of their politics that the Soviet Union has collapsed. There is only one superpower, and this will be the place of American hegemony. America is going to dictate to the world what to do, both on economic matters and on political geostrategic matters, you know. And of course, you know, we can run through this is the beginning. I mean, President George H.W. Bush would give the speech to the joint session in September of 1991. Soviet Union is collapsing, and he gives a speech of the New World Order, and people were scratching their head. That means people in Europe, what is the New World Order? Well, we know what is the New World Order now, you know, 30 plus years later. This is the UN agenda. This is the Rio summit. This is the Kyoto Agreement, 1992. Global warming, man-made global warming that becomes climate change, and so on and so forth. And this is going to be pushed by the Democrats. That is the green energy program. That is all of this, which is redistribution of wealth and so on and so forth. No national boundaries and United Nations.
Well,
and of course,
yeah, and if you read Putin's speech from 2 days ago, he says very clearly that the globalists that want dominance have made Russia the enemy, right? And he couldn't have said it better. It's true.
100%. And you can see the play that is going on. So putting all of this in the background, the critical issue came about with the change of administration in Washington. Maybe the change of administration in Washington that we talk about is basically a cosmetic change because they're all globalists. George H.W. Bush was a globalist. He was replaced by Clinton. Clinton is a globalist. But in the Clinton administration, the big issue that comes back now to haunt everybody is that Clinton led this negotiation over agreement known as the Budapest Memorandum 1994. Budapest, capital of Hungary, which was part of the Soviet Warsaw Pact countries,
Right.
So what was this agreement? Well, the agreement that was negotiated and signed by United States, United Kingdom, that is Britain, and the Russian Federation involved Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. It was Clinton who moved the argument that these countries need to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and give up the nuclear weapon. And then it will be the responsibility of the nuclear power countries. So the 3 nuclear power countries are also the permanent members of the Security Council. That is Great Britain, United States, and Russia will sign the agreement to guarantee the security of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Ukraine had a massive stockpile of nuclear weapons because Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had deployed those weapons in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan was the testing ground of Soviet nuclear stockpile. And from there, the Soviet Union would launch their intercontinental ballistic missile, their space missile, their satellites, and so on and so forth. With the fall of Soviet Union, Kazakhstan became an independent country. Belarus became an independent country. Belarus had nuclear stockpile, but the largest nuclear stockpile was in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And so Ukraine was made to give up its nuclear stockpile or to hand over the nuclear stockpile in return for guarantees from the 3 nuclear power for security. But the underlying understanding of the guarantee is and was, going back to the discussions with Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. Putin was not around at that time. Putin was an unknown Russian, military officer in the GRU. And he would arise from that position later on in the politics of Russia. So we're talking about Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. And the subtext of the agreement was, as all the leaders in Europe had said to Gorbachev and then Boris Yeltsin, that NATO will not expand 1 centimeter eastward towards Moscow.
Right.
Okay, so that was the guarantee.
Mm.
Then we can fast track now and come to where we are. That is the Obama administration. Clinton left. George Bush came on. George Bush was another globalist. He engaged in, because of 9/11, he went into Afghanistan, he went into Iraq, the regime change, the endless warfare. Now, looking back, you know, some 15, 20 years, we can see that all of those activities was in part, the globalist agenda of putting, the stamp of the one world thing, that the argument that was made. Saddam was a bad guy. But the argument that was made that Saddam has a stockpile of,
Weapons of mass destruction.
weapons of mass destruction and biochemical weapons, and that these are going to be used. And former Secretary of State who passed away recently, another globalist, Colin Powell, went to the UN, and many of us who trusted the Americans supported the Americans.
Right.
Because Saddam Hussein was not only a bad guy, he had committed genocide. He had used chemical weapons against his own people, the Kurdish people, and he was a massive threat. He had taken over Kuwait. He had fought a war with Iran for 8 years, and he was threatening Israel and so on and so forth. He was a bad guy. And even the Arab countries were happy to get rid of him, But the arguments that was presented and the media that ran the story was all fabrication. Now we can see it. It was total fabrication. And so what happened during that 8 years of Bush administration was countries like Georgia tried to do the same thing, which is happening in Ukraine right now. They tried to bring in America on the basis that we are going to become democracy, and George Bush was propagating the argument that it is America's responsibility to help build Jeffersonian democracy in effect in countries that have no history of democracy and the meaning of democracy as we in the West, particularly Americans, understand it. If democracy means an election, well, Saddam Hussein has an election, Kim Jong-un has an election, and everybody else has an election. And everybody has a constitution, and so on and so forth. But it was used, the argument was used, and what it became was a color revolution, that Americans would find their, instrument in these countries, give them the money, as your video showed, the National Endowment for Democracy. I remember reading and going to the conference of National Endowment for Democracy, in Washington, and people calling us up. I was at that time, fully engaged in these issues as a professor, talking about democracy. And of course, we are interested in democracy, whether it is Pakistan, whether it is Iraq, whether it is, whatever, we are interested. But that this was an agenda that was being pushed in terms of color revolution would then explode. We did not understand it. Most people did not understand it. But that came about in 2009 with the Obama administration taking over. One of the major first steps that the Obama administration did with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, you can find the picture, everywhere. If people explore it, is Hillary Clinton after taking her oath of office, traveling to Moscow in March of 2009, and meeting with the Russian foreign minister, her counterpart, who's still the foreign minister in Russia, Sergei Lavrov. And the famous picture of Hillary Clinton offering Sergei Lavrov a button to press. He was confused what it is about. And she laughed. Is it the Great Reset?
Yeah.
Remember the word Great Reset.
Right.
This is the Great Reset now, is fully exposed. The word had come into effect. So this was it, that Russia would be set for a great reset, and Russia brought into the World Economic Forum agenda, So this whole idea is these oligarchs billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and George Soros. And by the way, George Soros was involved with Hillary Clinton in what was happening
Right.
in Russia and Ukraine, can
Mm.
go around, fly in on the jet plane, John Kerry, and so on and so forth, Chrystia
Mm.
Freeland, Justin Trudeau, fly into Russia, fly into Africa, throw out the money, whether it is on their favorite issues, climate change, and whatever else is wokeism, transgenderism, etc., and bring these people, that is the governments, on board to the WEF.
Right. Right.
So that was the game that was played, and what it became lethal was that in Ukraine, the first effort put forward by these people, the one world people, was the color revolution of 2004, 2005, when the election was manipulated against uh, the man who subsequently would become the president, Viktor Yanukovych,
Mm.
by bringing his election down and getting a Western supporter, his, Victor, um, I forget his name, Yushchenko.
Yushchenko, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Viktor Yushchenko. So there was a runoff in 2004 after this massive color revolution, which is called the Orange Revolution. People were mobilized. John McCain was there. Victoria Nuland was there.
Didn't they poison Yushchenko?
Yushchenko was poisoned by some sort of
Yeah.
powder, and he survived and he came out of it, and he became the hero. So
Right.
the rumor was that the Russians had poisoned him, or it was Russian KGB agents and others had done that. But Viktor Yanukovych lost that election, and he retreated. That means, he went back to whatever he was doing. But he came back in the 2010 election. And in the 2010 election, Viktor Yanukovych won that election. And then on the second term for that election was 2014. And there again, the color revolution happened. That became violent. The first one was not violent, but the
Right.
second one became violent in the Maidan Square.
Yeah.
Couple of hundred people died. People split on both sides: the pro-Russian, the anti-Russian, and so on and so forth. And Viktor Yanukovych, who had won that election in January, had to flee when he was ousted in the parliament by a vote. And that is where the whole question of the video that was played, that
Right.
is pro-Nazi element, people who had participated or whose ancestors had participated on the side of the Germans, organized against Viktor Yanukovych, and then had him ousted from the parliament on a rigged vote. That is the accusation. And Viktor Yanukovych fled, but he was stopped. And under, again, mysterious circumstances, he was able to get away. But the government that came to office, Poroshenko became the president, they issued an international police warrant for arrest and to bring him to the International Criminal Court. And that turned out, clearly it played and showed that the Western powers, that is particularly America, was engaged in this color revolution to draw the country into its own orbit. And it is in that context that the referendum took place in Crimea. And Putin, now the president, Putin sent in his military personnel and support to the Donbass region, where you have the two new quasi-republic or proto-republic that had been formed. It was formed in 2014. Now Putin has officially recognized them as independent republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, and Crimea has been, joined, taken back into Russia, and so on. So that is where the picture is. And the case of the Obama administration, is defeated. That is, Hillary is defeated in 2016 election. President Trump comes in, and what did President Trump do? Well, he said that he's going to drain the swamp. Well, one of the swamp that his administration found is Ukraine as the
Mhm.
cash cow for the Democrats.
Right. Money laundering.
So he asked in that famous telephone call to Zelensky to investigate what is happening in Ukraine,
Right.
and to let his administration know about it. Because in the last month of Obama regime, Biden went to Ukraine, and in the famous video that was shot, Biden sitting and boasting that he told the Ukrainian government that I'm sitting here, and he looks at his watch and he said, in 1 hour or 2 hours, I'm flying out. And if your prosecutor general is not fired, you're not going to get the money. That is the
Right.
billion.
Right.
Okay. So who was the prosecutor general investigating at that time? It was Burisma, the company, and the oligarchs of Burisma, and the people behind Burisma, who are even bigger oligarchs, who had been sucking dry whatever little money on wealth that Ukraine has. Ukraine is one of the most corrupt regimes in Eastern Europe. Um, it is run by the oligarchs. The Western governments are now talking about Ukraine is the bread basket and Ukraine is the resource. Well, it is the bread basket in the time of the Soviet Union. It has the resources, but who has benefited from all of this? People who have benefited from all of this is Hunter Biden,
Right.
Joe Biden, Obama, Hillary Clinton, the Clinton Foundation, who were paid in millions of dollars by the Ukrainian oligarch to buy protection. So this is the pay to play. This is the mafia in operation.
Right.
This is what President Trump wanted to be investigated. And that resulted in the very people in America, in Washington, who had Ukrainian background, like this guy, Colonel Vindman. He's a Ukrainian American in the army who was on the national security staff of the White House, and a whole lot of other people who rigged up the case that President Trump was using Zelensky against his political opponent domestically, that is the Biden family. And on
Right.
that basis, he was impeached, you know?
Mm.
So, but apart from that, the fact of the matter is that for the 4 years that President Trump was there, Putin did not do anything or did not demand anything. He knew that there could be a working arrangement between President Trump and himself, just as President Trump was dealing with the China issue, or the North Korean issue. And they could work out each other's national interests without jeopardizing each other's position.
Right.
And in the case of Russia, the main issue was Ukraine should not be brought into NATO, which would mean American troops and NATO weapons, including nuclear weapons, would likely end up in Ukraine, pointing at the heart of Russia, just as Russian Soviet missiles in Cuba would be pointing to the heart of United States. So there would be no President Trump under him, there would be no such activity. But you can see that within a matter of months after President Trump left the White House,
Right.
Biden started escalating the issue of Ukraine on the grounds that Ukraine has the right as a sovereign country, independent country, to make a decision to join the NATO. And by the way, when President Trump and his people, President Biden and his people are saying that Ukraine has the right to join NATO, none of the major European members of NATO, in particular Germany and France, agreed with that position.
Right. Right. Well, because
So
they know exactly what would happen.
they knew exactly what, but it is their governments who had made the promise to
Right.
Moscow that
Right.
NATO would not move 1 centimeter east
East.
towards Moscow.
Right.
So that is the context within which this has happened. So
Mhm.
why did Putin go in? Well, Putin saw that this is a festering problem. Just as for the Americans, Cuba is a festering problem.
Mm.
And he decided, looking at Biden and looking at the weakness of the Biden administration and the duplicity of the Biden administration, that is the one world people, both
Yep.
uniparty, it doesn't
Yep.
matter whether you're Democrat or Republican, the rhinos, the one world people, the weakness of them. And in the case of Biden administration, the weakness became absolutely exposed after the Afghanistan debacle, when Biden basically fled Afghanistan, handing over power to the Taliban and handing over the assets that the Americans had provided to the Taliban over 20 years, more than $2 trillion expenditure.
Mm.
And Biden left behind close to $90 billion of advanced American weaponry in the hands of the Taliban, so that the Taliban can then, they can't manage those weapons, but they can, parcel them out to China and to Pakistan, which
Right.
possibly they have done. And
Mm.
especially the strategic air base that the Americans had built, the Bagram Air Base, which is on the border of China and former Soviet Republic, in the sense,
Right.
that is the base from where the Americans could look into what is happening in China if there is problem, and also Russia. Well, they handed it over to the Taliban. And so, looking at this display of duplicity and weakness and pushing the agenda of the World Economic Forum, Putin basically said, this is the moment,
Mm.
to end this mess, that is
Right.
threatening Russia. And so they have gone in, and they will take over Kiev, and they will, in effect, have a regime in Kiev after there is a ceasefire, the shooting stops, and Ukraine will be, as is Georgia, will be a country that will be neutralized. Well,
Mm.
Switzerland has been a neutral country through two world wars, through two
Mm.
blocks, East Bloc, West Bloc, NATO, Warsaw. That is what the arrangement was all about. But it
Right.
is the world economic agenda of the Davos crowd that has pushed this matter over the precipice, and the results that was more or less expected has happened.
Right.
So, upon whom rests the responsibility, in my view, who are culpable for this? It is Biden administration and its allies in European countries that have been pushing on this issue.
Right. So, uh, and we covered a lot of ground in that hour. I'd like there's a couple of people in the chat that are asking if they could ask some questions of you, Salim. Are you up to a little bit of Q&A here for a bit?
Yeah,
Or?
of course, of
All
course.
right. So you guys go ahead and fire away your questions. And Malazan Fiddler, I just, when we're going through this, I don't interrupt Salim when he's speaking. He's on a track and he stays on that track, and then he wraps up at the end. And that's what we've seen tonight. And that's what it is every night. I know you're new to this, but that's sort of how it works. I'm more than happy to open up the floor to Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, by all means, fire away. I'm just waiting to see some questions. Somebody had mentioned, so what Putin said about what's really going on in the Ukraine was absolutely true.
Is the
I think
reference?
I think what he said in his speech,
Yeah.
makes sense to me.
Yes.
I read the speech and it makes sense, and that doesn't mean I'm biased. That doesn't mean that I'm a pom pom boy for Putin. It just means what he said, based on what we know, it makes sense and it seems reasonable, right? Marilyn asked how to compare what happened in Cuba before Castro and what is happening now in Russia. I'm not sure I understand your question, Marilyn. Maybe Salim does.
No, I don't understand it. What happened in Cuba before Castro? There was a Batista regime, which was a corrupt regime, but it was
Right.
not a communist regime.
Right. So what does Salim think will happen next?
Well, I'll be repeating myself. I concluded saying that once the shooting stops, Kiev has fallen. The latest understanding, I believe, is that the Russian troops have encircled Kiev, the capital, and once
So you think that
then,
he's going to annex eastern Ukraine?
well, the
Is he?
eastern, no, I mean, he has recognized the republics of the self-proclaimed, self-determined
Yeah.
republics of
Yeah.
Donetsk and Luhansk. He doesn't have to annex them. They are uh, technically independent, but they will be allied to Moscow. That's what exactly the neutralization is. I mean, they can have their own governments. Kiev will have its own government, but it will not be a government that is going to, after this experience. I mean, this drama has been going on for over 30 years. And what Putin has done, he has called the shot and ended the drama. He has said, enough is enough. And we are not going to allow this thing to fester any longer. Ukraine is not going to be a member of NATO state. So whoever forms the government in Ukraine after all of this is over will not be a member of will not take Ukraine into NATO, and that's exactly what was Moscow's interest.
Was agreed to in the first place, right?
That's right.
Marilyn says the U.S. was so involved there, and I think she's referring to Cuba. They were ousted. Is this what Russia is trying to do in the Ukraine?
The U.S. was what? I didn't get it.
It's on the screen there.
Oh, okay. Let me look for it. The U.S. was so involved there. There means where? Cuba or
Cuba.
Ukraine?
I think Cuba.
Well, the U.S. has a little island, as a little that Guantanamo base. That's it. That's what they have, and they have not given it up. But Cuba, whether one likes it or not, is an independent country. It's a communist country until the Cuban people overthrow that government and have their own, and it is up to the Cuban people.
Right. Yep. I think that's it. I'm not seeing any other any questions coming in here. Just some comments. So I think we'll wrap it up there. I'd like to upload this before it gets too long in the tooth. And so thank you very much, Salim, again, for adding context to this issue that everybody's focused on. And I think it's important that people understand that there's a lot of things at play. There's a lot of pieces moving and moving parts to this. And it's important to understand. I think you helped us do that. So thank you, Salim.
Thank you.
We'll see what's up before next week, and we do this again.
Okay.
There's always something happening, so we'll have something in place to discuss.
I imagine by next week the matter will be more or less resolved in terms of Russia will have established its control over the rest of Ukraine. you can see that I don't want to take too much time, but the key issues over the last week has been that the energy supply from Russia to Germany and Europe,
Mm.
Germans are not going to accept any stoppage to that, Nord Stream 2, though the Americans, i- ironically, is helping Russia so that the gas price has gone up. Now it's gone over 100 barrel, is
Right.
helping Russia. So, I mean, what sort of calculation the Americans have that is the Biden administration have? And there's a whole issue of energy in this
Yeah.
discussion that we haven't touched upon,
Yeah.
but uh, there's so much more to say, but for tonight, just to conclude on this issue, whatever people might think about Putin, Putin is a nationalist.
Yes.
The fall of Soviet
Yes.
Union ended communism in Russia.
Mm.
The greatest voice from Russia during the 20th century. Russia is a land of great people, great
Mm.
history in the sense of the people and their history
Mm.
and their culture. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Pushkin, and so on. So in the 20th century, the voice of Russia, of Russian people, was full Solzhenitsyn. And
Yes.
as I would say to my students, if you haven't read Solzhenitsyn and you don't want to read Solzhenitsyn, you will never know what the 20th century history is all about and has been about,
Mm. Mm.
given what Russia and Russian people suffered in terms of Stalinism, communism, and so on. And in a sense, the fall of Soviet Union did not happen by itself. It happened because of the resistance of the Russian people.
Right.
When the solidarity movement began in Poland, and then as it spread, Russian people were fully in support of solidarity movement, Lech Walesa, and they were pushing to bring down the end of the Soviet Union, that is communism. It was the most important peaceful revolution in 20th century history. A
Mm.
mighty empire just collapsed, and it was a mighty military empire, a nuclear power empire that
Right.
collapsed, and peacefully. It did not, go into the rest of Europe. It did not do any of the damages. But as it collapsed, the people who were students of Russian history, great minds, like George Kennan, and I haven't talked about him, maybe in future we can talk about him, pointed out that you do not humiliate Russia. You understand Russia and you work with Russia. And Russian democracy, as it evolved, is second to none of the other Eastern European countries. You cannot say that Ukraine has evolved to a democracy greater than Russia, or
Mm.
Poland has evolved into a democracy greater than Russia. Russia is advancing. It is having its challenges. It is a country around 9 time zone. And
Mm.
Putin, succeeding Boris Yeltsin, succeeding Gorbachev, is a Russian patriot.
Mm.
And
Yep.
he was engaged in defending Russian interests. And
Absolutely.
Kennan and Mitterrand and others warned against this. So it is
Mm.
the one worlder globalists in America, their clones and clowns in Canada. When Justin Trudeau says, as he did a couple of days ago, we will stand with Ukraine for the freedom of Ukraine, for the independence of Ukraine, and we will do whatever is needed and supply them with whatever they need for the freedom of Ukraine. This is the man who was stomping his jackboot on the face of the Canadian people.
Yes.
Where is the credibility of this man?
Mm.
Just as he was stomping upon the face of Canadian people in terms of Emergency Act,
Mm.
throwing Tamara Leach into prison, calling her names, calling the people fringe movement.
Mm.
This poor woman, Tamara Leach, whatever is her politics is not, it makes no difference. She was standing for freedom. She is our Joan of Arc. She is our Rosa Parks. She was
Mm.
arrested, no bail given to her.
Right.
So This is where the leadership is. I mean, here is Biden talking about the independence and freedom and the sovereignty and the borders of Ukraine. He has opened the southern border of the United States, and within 1 year of his office, over 2 million people have walked into America. It's an open invasion taking place in America. This is the one world agenda, the global compact on migration. So they speak from one end of their mouth one thing, from the other end of the mouth another thing. All of this is fabricated. Their agenda is to go ahead. His climate czar John Kerry is talking about climate. The worst victim of the Ukraine conflict, according to John Kerry, former Secretary of State in the Obama administration, the greatest victim of the Ukraine crisis is climate.
Yes.
So
well
there
said.
you have it.
Yep.
So
absolutely. All right,
Thank
Salim.
you.
I'll be in touch. I'll
Yes,
give you a call in a couple of days. We'll chat and we'll figure out what we're going to do next week.
absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you,
All
sir.
right, my friend.
Thank you.
Take care of yourself.
Bye-bye.
Bye now. All right. Another round with Salim. And I think obviously very important to get his perspective. And again, it's not that we're Putin pom-pom boys. It's just you have to look at everything. The media doesn't want you to look at anything. They just want to instill the narrative and indoctrinate the masses and keep them stupid and so they can continue on doing what they're doing around the world. And so it's important that we offer that different perspective. So that's what we do here. Speaking of offering different perspectives, and truthful discussion and conversation, that gets me in a lot of hot water on social media, with Facebook and YouTube and all these others. Right now, I can't stream live on Facebook because I'm too dangerous, I guess. I was nuked on Facebook, completely pulled off Facebook, where my profile didn't even exist for a week. And that started on the morning of the Ottawa siege. So I can only think that it's completely related to that. I'm back on Facebook. Who knows how long? But I can't go live there. So far I'm still on Twitch, Twitter, and DLive. And I'm using, which I'm a little surprised at, YouTube, which is really just my YouTube under my name, just Mark Friesen. So if you want to subscribe to my YouTube, by all means do so. Again, I never can tell how long I'm going to have the account for, but I don't know. Other people seem to be able to keep their YouTubes going, so maybe I just have to be a touch more careful. I don't know. I have to speak truth. I have to tell people what I know, and if it gets me in trouble, it gets me in trouble. I always record these episodes and upload them to Rumble. So if you want to watch this later, it'll be on YouTube for as long as it's on YouTube, and it'll be on Rumble. And Rumble's been really good. So that's where we're at. And yes, I am feeling much better. Just give you an update in that regard. I'm off the antibiotics. I'm off oxygen. I'm really, probably around somewhere between 75 and 80%. I still have a lot of work to do to get my muscle mass back. And lung capacity is another issue. I climb the stairs fairly well, but I'm a little bit out of breath when I get to the top. So that makes it challenging to build, get into physio or get into the gym and working out, because I don't have the breath to support it. So it's kind of like this vicious circle, but it's all coming, and it looks like the infection is staying away, so that's good news. So yeah, it is what it is. Yes, I know I can live stream on Rumble via StreamYard, but it costs me $100 a month, and I'm not in a position right now to make that payment. So Rumble's gonna have to wait. But yeah, I did go live on Rumble a few times, and even Odyssey, I can go live on. That one's free, but maybe I'll do it. Yes, Karen, I do. I do breathing exercises. Yep. And again, it's it's lung capacity and how much air I can get in there. And it's getting better. I mean, but it is slow but sure. Other people that my wife has talked to that, were in a coma for 5 weeks like I was, their recovery was about a year before they were, feeling back to normal. So, it is what it is. But yeah, thanks, boy. I appreciate that. So that's that. And that's the end of this stream. So thanks, guys. Appreciate the support. And remember, globalism, bad. Nationalism, good. Ciao for now, guys.
Just jump to the